My name is Emily Holland. I'm the editor of Poet Lore, which is America's oldest poetry magazine, published twice a year in print here at the Writers Center. Link to our website in the chat where you can subscribe or purchase single issues. And our newest issue is almost to the printer. We've had a few delays with it, but it's almost out. So super excited to have that in hand. But we are excited to welcome you to the virtual craft chat series, where we talk a little bit less with writers about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. Super excited to have tonight's guest, Ananda Lima, with us, who is a Poet Lore contributor, amazing poet, translator. Super excited. Ananda, thank you for being here with us tonight. So happy to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This is so great. And I love all the work that you do. There's just so much in there, and it's great to be a part of it. So I'm going to read 2 poems to get started, right?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, so I'm going to read 2 poems, one from my collection that just came out and one from Amblyopia, the chapbook. And I think these 2 poems, they sort of have in them a lot of what the book is about. So this first one is called Line, and I had a bookmark, but I lost it. There you go. So this one's called Line. I inherited from my mother the knobbly joints and square ends of my fingers. From my father, I got the habit of biting my nails. Their shortness, the frayed missing skin had never bothered me. But now I have a son, and he has begun to bite too. In America, I learned that I can snap a rubber band against my hand reaches up toward the mouth. On the back of my hand, the rubber band disappears into the color of my skin, but when I turn and face the inner side, it is a clear division of my body. The first time I saw a cotton tree, I found it beautiful. The cotton so white in its brown cradle, so soft against the square tips of my fingers. I squeezed the dead flower around it and felt joy from hearing it crackle. As children, we had cups full of sugarcane. We chewed on it and spit out the bagasse. Toothless men ran the knobbly stalks through a machine. The juice trickled into our glasses, and the flat piece that came out on the other side was put through it again until everything was gone. The dry split stalk thrown into a pile, limp like blonde hair. When I first arrived in America, I didn't understand what people meant when they said with an American accent that they were Irish or Italian or French. Now that I understand, I asked my mother for a family tree. She said she had never thought of such things, and she wouldn't know much past her grandmother's first name. So what I have is my memory of the faces of my relatives and my own. When I first arrived in America, all I could see was beauty. The snow, fine like sugar, white like cotton, but now the beauty, the land, the tired metaphors just make me sad. Before I left for America, I saw an individual in the mirror, but today I see my father, my mother, my brothers, my son, and a man missing skin from tears on his back, and the man who did it. When I looked this morning, I tugged on my rubber band so hard that it broke. All right, so that was, thank you. That was Line, and then this other poem I'm going to read, I think it is the same for this chapbook, so it's the one that captures a lot of the themes in this chapbook. And it's called Amblyopia. Amblyopia is a visual condition that is known as lazy eye, which I have and my son has. Amblyopia. I close my right eye, meu olho direito, and see everything. Tudo my mother, my father, meus pais didn't know to do then. Not a matter of laziness, the doctor says. It's more of a suppression, a lack of focus. Think of the right eye as a bully. Think of the left eye as too weak to fight. Think of the two eyes unable to work right together. And I was left, grown, done with the plasticity of a body that is still building. A gift said not to last, and I was left with a speckled Super 8, the grainy film, the faint dark surface of an old mirror. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reading from your new book and the chapbook, which I'm excited to talk about as well. I do want to make a note that Zach has also put a link in the chat to make sure that you please order a copy of the book. I'm waiting on mine, so I have the digital copy here, but please order a copy. It is so wonderful. And if you don't have a copy already, you're definitely going to want to be able to pore over these poems again and again. That is the best way to support authors and your local bookstore and publishers. So please order a copy. I also wanted to say to those of you in the audience, we really encourage you to ask questions. So please put any questions that you have in the chat. I always try to weave in between my own questions and the questions that come up in the chat for our conversation. So don't be shy with your questions there. All right. So Ananda, I think maybe we'll start with an easy question. Just tell us a little bit about who you are, how you came to poetry and writing, and then we'll get to the harder questions after that.
That's great. So I think so. I came here to the US as a linguistics person for grad school. I wrote then, but it was very private. I didn't even like go to craft classes or anything like that. It was really just my thing, you know. I didn't think of myself as a writer. I thought I'm going to be a linguist, you know. So it was very subterranean for a long time. I wrote as a kid, but same thing. It was just one of many things. I was a photographer openly much earlier than I was a writer openly. Maybe being a photographer helped me sort of take the leap. I realized that even though I love linguistics and I loved the studying of linguistics, I realized that was not like my single focus and my single thing, which it had to be for you to live that life. You know, it's a hard life, you know, if you choose to be an academic in writing or in anything, it's like you are going to have to move to wherever and take whatever job, if any. And I was like, I'm not so focused on this thing that is going to justify or even work, even though I love this subject. But making that decision allowed me to consider other possibilities, which I hadn't for a while. And then photography came. And then once that was out, I was like, no, it actually is writing. And once it was writing, it was writing. First, when I first sort of showed work to a person, you know, even like friends or whatever, it was fiction. So I first thought of myself as a writer of fiction, but I'll get lines, like I'll get this line I like an image, it's very workable in fiction, you know, like if it's, but I'll get a very specific line, and then I'll write a story and I will be going like, what am I doing? I only like this line in the story. And I realized that it was poetry, and poetry sort of took over. So I still write both poetry and fiction, but poetry really never stops happening. Fiction is something that I sort of have to keep pushing myself to do. I love it, but it's poetry just always happens for me. So I did an MFA in fiction, but I wrote more poetry during that time than I wrote fiction, even though I wrote a lot of fiction.
Great. Well, I love that. And I think maybe we'll end up talking about some of those other influences on your work later in the chat. So maybe this one is kind of maybe the toughest question that we have, just because it's a little bit more about looking inward in your own work. We always talk about poets noticing things, and there's so much to notice about your own work. But is there something that you do, maybe like a certain craft element or something specific that you utilize a lot in your work that maybe goes unnoticed or doesn't get a lot of attention, or maybe something that's a habit that you try to write against sometimes?
Yeah, I love that question. So I think that there's one thing that I think, especially in the process of talking about where, because you write, and you kind of know intuitively, but when you start doing interviews or talking about things, you start realizing verbally about your work. But one that is a big one for me, and I think when we talked a little bit before the interview, I realized, oh, you totally see that. So I'm very much about the line break. I think the line break gives me a lot of energy when I'm writing. It really, I think, part of that poetry taking over my fiction, for example, I think is this energy of the line break. There's just so much possibility there. And I think many times it's very visible and people see it. But sometimes there's some that I feel like, oh, only I am getting a kick out of this thing, that happens sometimes with whatever, but also especially if I'm using two languages, the break may be really funny in Portuguese or something, but not in English or vice versa. So I do get a lot from the line break. I think sometimes it's more visible than others. And it's kind of fun to have sometimes these little things that it's like, I don't know if people are going to see it, but I see it and I like it. So one is the line breaks. Another one is with line breaks and translation and like homophones, right? So if I'm doing, I play with this translations that use repeating forms, right? So you kind of get a guide, that, oh, in a pantun, this line would repeat here. So therefore is the translation, and you can see some homophones and everything. But I think one thing that you may not necessarily see is that this word means other things in the other language, right? That I'm accessing. And I know it's there and it gives me a lot of joy. But I also am okay with people missing it, so it's kind of fun. But I do have this one friend who lives in New Jersey, and she was in I had like this mother's writing group thing. And she is from my city in Brazil, which is very rare in the same little town in New Jersey. And I would read to the group, and she would sometimes like giggle, and I was like, oh yeah, I forgot, because I'm so used to reading and just like enjoying it for myself. And she would like giggle. Like there was one, for example, in translation, this poem translation, there's the word mass, right? Like MASS. And the translation in Portuguese is massa, which means mass, but it also means pasta. So I kind of giggled when I did that. And then she totally got it because it's about eating and devouring, but it's also fine when people don't get it. Also on this question, very briefly, there was a review that just came out like last week for Motherland, that I was like, oh my gosh, this person, I've never seen it. Like she got so many things that were in the poem, the poems that I hadn't seen other people get or talk about anyways, and sometimes I put things come out in the poem that I think, oh, this is very obvious. It's even maybe too obvious. And like nobody ever mentions this. I was like, oh, okay, maybe it wasn't. But she mentioned a bunch of things. One of them is like, just an example. There's this poem I have, When They Come For Us for the 7 train, on the 7 train. And for me, I put a very, and when I say I put, it's not like I decided to put it, it just sort of came out in the poem, you know. But there's a reference to the Underground Railroad in the poem, like not like a specific. There's a reference to it, right? Like, and I was like, oh, I wonder if that's true on the notes, but nobody has ever mentioned or that ever. And then, so I forget. I was like, okay, that's maybe not as obvious as I thought it was, which is good, you know. And she mentioned that in the review. I was like, oh, it is there. It's not only in my imagination. So I think there's this fun things where I'm not sure if the things that I think either are obvious or are there in my head, or they are accessible to other people. But I'm somebody who really enjoys that. You know, I enjoy that people may read my poem differently than I do. I think that's very interesting and fun.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying about, I mean, especially about the line breaks, which I really want to talk about, but there's a way that some of these things, even if they're not readily apparent on the first read or the second read or to every reader, you're not losing anything by not seeing them. But when you do see them, you gain so much about the poem, and we learn so much about your style as a poet too. So I think the things that I've been able to see that I've said, oh, that's such a clever line break, or, you know, the different meanings that can occur is super fun. So I love that is something that you think about too. And I'm sure that not everyone is missing them. Maybe they just don't want to be wrong. So yeah, since we started talking a little bit about line breaks, and you read the poem Line, which I was excited for you to read, could you talk about just how you approach line breaks in general? Does that sort of playfulness with them come later, like in revision, or is that something that you do when you're first kind of setting out to write a poem?
Yeah, I love that question. And I'm so curious about how like other people do it too. So for me, it's different from poem to poem, but mostly like first drafts for me come in lines. So, and I don't really think about that much where the line is as I'm writing the first draft, but they do come in lines. So I don't write a block and then break it. It's like a line comes, the next as I'm writing. Or if I'm walking around thinking about a poem, I would have like a couple of lines repeating. I feel like I get, as I was mentioning, I get a lot of energy in the writing process from that break. You know, I write towards the break. And it gives me impulse. And I think I really enjoy endings that give echoes or shades of other meanings because of what that word means when it breaks here versus when it continues in the sentence. And I think that gives me a lot of impulse to go to the next line. In revision, I will re-break. Very often, you know, I do it too much. You know, every line has something. I'm like, no. Let's like get the ones that, you know, the thing where sometimes you have one great sentence and 2 awesome ones, but if you cut the 2, the best one shines. You know, so I have to do some of that with the line breaks because I find it so fun. That I'm like, okay, but this is fun, but let's let this other main one do its job better. So I think I write in lines, and they are somewhat close to what it ends up in the end, but I do a lot of rearranging, a lot of this first word going up, you know. I don't write a lot of prose poems or blocks or whatever, but often when I do, they were lineated poems before that I sort of had to free from that thing that I love and put it in a block. And usually when I write, I copy the poem, so then I'm free to change it, right? So I have the first draft, I copy it, because then I'm like, okay, it's fine, you can change it. So a lot of those copies will be just one or two words jumping from one line to the other.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you said that, because I do the same thing when I'm drafting. My Google Doc for one poem will just be pages long. And sometimes I'm like, which version did I like? Like which one? And there's just maybe one or two words, but that's really interesting. I love hearing about people's revision process. And it is comforting to know that, okay, the original is always going to be there. Like you're not going to mess it up too much that you can never get that magic back. So that's exciting. Yeah, I wanted to call attention to one of like the really early line breaks in the poem that kind of precedes the sections, the in-flight entertainment while the doomsday seed bank is breached, which is a great title, but also a really great poem. And in the second line with the soft light of ice, and then the third line, age falling round his cheeks. So at first you think ice, like, okay, there's some kind of cold terrain and you're thinking about the seed bank, but then you get ice age and you're like, oh, the movie is in the in-flight entertainment. So there's just some clarity and some really interesting meaning there. And that was one of the really fun ones for me. And seeing that so early in the collection, I was like, okay, there's going to be some more of this for sure. So that was really fun. I wanted to also talk a little bit about some of the other visual forms. I read one of your recent interviews where you talked about like the visible meaning making elements of a poem. So like the line break, but then you also use some visual forms like Amblyopia. The poem that you read has the fading ink in the Portuguese side. And then there's kind of the word search, the dissolving columns in bird, in motherland. So could you talk about embracing sort of those visual elements on the page that we don't really hear as much when we hear the poem aloud?
Yeah, so that's such a lovely question. So yeah, so I think a lot of these things, like I talk about it after, just because I thought about it, or because people ask me questions or whatever, but I'm not thinking about it like so consciously when I'm doing it, But I think basically, poetry itself, just in its most basic, like sort of lineated poem, there's work that is being done by the visual. And when I say visual, I think it's visual for me, but it could be some other thing for somebody else. It could be sonic or whatever. But there's something done without words that is not just the words. And the arrangement on the page does sort of meaningful work, right? So in the case of line breaks, the things that we were talking about before, the Amblyopia one where the text is fading, that experience of writing that poem for me was very similar to putting line breaks, So it wasn't like I sat and I was like, these are gonna fade on the side. As I was writing, I sort of had some sort of idea that there's two columns somehow, and I start writing, and as I separated them, I was like, intuitively, it feels like this is what it's going to be. I think it's a little bit similar. I don't know. I'm not a painter at all. That's why I was a photographer, because I cannot do things with my hands like that. But what I picture a painter doing, painting their thing and standing back and sort of smudging it here and painting over here. So very intuitive process. But the visual it's not a big break for me. It's not a big break to start playing with that versus a line break. It's just sort of an extension of playing with the things that are not verbal, that are working with the verbal. And it's very intuitive process. I think this, in Amblyopia, there's a poem that is heart chart, that is like it's like a heart chart is a chart that is used for vision exercises. But that one was a little bit more intentional because I had the subject matter and I had the experience that I wanted to do, and I had a heart chart. So I kind of knew from the beginning it was going to look like that. It was almost like a form. It was like working with a form when you say, I'm going to write a pantun or something like that. I was like, okay, this is going to look like this. And I'm going to fill it out, you know, versus Amblyopia was like, I'm going to write a poem about Amblyopia. And that is kind of what came out. But I think the visual is very much an extension of just a regular poem. Yes.
Yeah, I love the way that the form, even the visual form, meshes with the content of the poems, like Ode to Wet Concrete, how it kind of slithers down the page, and there's like so many different water and kind of liquid references in Motherland too. So that was really cool to see as well. Maybe I'll pop in the chat because I see a few questions coming in. Kashiana is asking about using Portuguese in your work. So do you ever feel the need to explain or I guess translate the Portuguese, or do you leave that on the reader? I think this is always something that people kind of wrestle with when they're working with different languages there.
I love that question. That's a great question. Thank you. So I think a lot of times in the process of writing a particular poem, it's also a very intuitive decision. You know, I'm not thinking like, okay, I'm going to put Portuguese to mean this or that at the time, you know, but thinking about the whole thing as a whole, I think one thing overall in this book and in a lot of my work is that my experience as an immigrant, and I think it's not just for immigrants, it's anybody who is from a group that is not like whatever is the main group at that setting. So I can imagine, for example, a first generation college person, something like that. There are always things that you have no idea what people are talking about. And you're filling the gaps all the time. So people are talking about that commercial back in the 80s, and I have no idea what they're talking about. All the time. That happens all the time. And you know, I think it doesn't hurt to sometimes be in that other position, you know, as an English speaker that doesn't speak Portuguese. I think that's a valid experience for the reader to go through. And it's not only for the reader to feel like excluded, even though I think it's good for people to have that experience, like not in a mean way. But I actually find a lot of joy in that personally, you know, like as a reader or in just experiencing life, I like reading stuff that there's part of it that I don't completely access, that I can either look it up or imagine, and I enjoy that experience. You know, it's kind of like an open door for learning or whatever. So I think it's kind of a gift that I give my readers to be able to do that. If they don't look it up, like to be able to try and construct the meaning from the other things. And if what they come up with is a little off, that's okay too. You know, that's kind of what happens to me all the time in life. So that governs the thing in a higher level. And I also think it opens a lot of space for play that is fun, of how they can work together harmoniously or sometimes in tension. And it just gives a lot of time of play stuff. And also sometimes it's just very natural, you know, like you're sort of going with the sounds or whatever. And it's just such a natural thing for me to to mix them sometimes. So there's all of that.
Yeah. No, I really love that. I think some people are echoing in the chat, thinking of that as a gift to the reader, right? Like you can put in that extra effort and do the looking up of the words and really get that meaning, or you can use some extra imaginative effort and really get some creative meaning in there too. And I really love that, putting the reader in a different position than maybe they're always used to being put in. And isn't that what poetry's for? I think that's exactly what it's for. So that's great. Gary is asking about working in fiction and poetry. Would you say that your poems tend more towards narrative than lyric? And then, this is a two-part question. When you revise, are you alert to phrases and connectiveness that may tend to the prosaic and might be replaced with images?
Very lovely. I love that. Yes. So I think I'm not sure. I love that question, and it's things I have to sort of think about. And sometimes I'm not sure. So I think maybe I tend to narrative, but I think I'm lyric, but I think I tend to be accessible, perhaps not always, but in the grand spectrum of things. And I think that may be something that the fiction sort of communicates with the poetry. I think the prose, right? Prose is what I have to really sweat when I'm working, right? So I think my most natural is poetry. One thing that I find interesting about me as a person that writes both is that some people, they write prose and poetry and they're closer to each other. So, like some of the stuff is in the middle and you don't know which is which. And the poetry will have a lot of prose poems and there'll be like flash fiction or something. Whereas I think I write very long short stories, and I write very long sentences and long paragraphs, So I think for me, they end up being very different. There's some sonic things that are similar, but sort of the breath is very different. And I'm not sure why that is. I do think that they sort of satisfy different expressive needs or something, because I think I go for very different things. I was talking about in the beginning getting lines and thinking they were stories. I think that was only in the very beginning. Now I'm like, oh no, this is poem stuff, this is fiction stuff, and there's less of that middle ground. I love people that write on that middle ground. It's just that I'm unfortunately not one of those.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe branch off that and think about, why poetry for this book. I read in another interview you did that you mentioned that, a poem doesn't have to make a closed argument, right? And in an interview with Shayla Sabri, we talked about, her book started out as an essay and then it turned into these kind of prose poems. And she said similar things, with an essay, you need to have a resolution. And she said, I knew I wouldn't have one. So I wonder if you could talk about at what moment you kind of realized the subject matter that you wanted to talk about in Motherland needed to be this book and these poems.
I love that. I need to watch that one. That sounds great. So I that is very right from like I think that sums up the big part of it very much. I think because poetry doesn't have to have as clear as closed an argument or as clear a path. And I know there's essayists and nonfiction people who I really admire who do all sorts of stuff. So they go around and do their thing and make it happen. But for me, poetry has a lot of space. Both, and it's not just about the ending, like closing, which I think is important for this question, but also all those line breaks, all that white space, all those associations. So I think for me, because I was writing about sometimes small things, but they connect with such big themes, I don't know, the history of the United States and my son doing some little cute little kid thing, but I wanted to have something that talks about all of those things. I think it's lovely to sometimes focus and cut and focus in one thing, but I wanted to have space for those connections to exist. And I think poetry, because of white space and line breaks and more ability to take leaps and not having to take the reader so clearly on their path, allows for all those themes to come in at the unsaid things or the associations. So for me, being poetry for this book really helped, to leave those reverberations there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. Reverberations, because throughout the sections, there's 3 sections to the book and they feel very contained, but those themes, certain things keep kind of recurring, and it's really interesting to think of those repetitions as reverberations, right? Almost like the drop in the water and then the kind of the ripples that come out. So I love that. I'm going to steal that.
I love that.
Reverberations. So I wanted to talk a little bit about translation itself, because in Poet Lore, we featured your translation work, which is how I was introduced to your work. And then, you do a little bit of kind of self-translation and twisting translations within your own work here. So could you talk about your approach to translating someone else's work, and then how you approach the other kind of versions of translation in your own work?
That's great. Love this question too. So thank you so much. I was so happy. Me and Anna, it's so great when you're working with a translation and it's like current live person, because you can share with them the good news. Mm-hmm. She was so happy as well. So I worked with linguistics before, and I'm a poet. So translation and a reader, I've always been around translation, and I've done like gigs in college or whatever, translating like commercial stuff. But I haven't done so much in my life, because I just have lots of things that I want to do. But I just love Anna's work. And also I love that she's a very sparse poet, and there's so much of that space that I'm fascinated with. And her language is so cool. She has a lot of play with registers, but she uses very simple, sometimes very plain language. So I just really enjoyed her as a reader. And I was like, okay, I'm going to translate this person, almost as a way to read her. So I contacted her, and we became like good friends. And translating her in particular was just a perfect match for me in terms of joy, because she has like this 2-word lines, and it was like sort of very simple at first, but then you're like, wait, what is the pronoun and what's the gender in the sentence? Because you can omit pronouns, right, in Portuguese, and it reads very simple, but then when you have to translate it, you notice all the stuff that is silently playing there. So it was just a joy. It was beautiful. So I translated some of her work, and then we became good friends. But then we mutually decided that we were not going to continue because of this reason. And it's all very good. She wanted more rhyme, because she translates from English to Portuguese. She's translated tons of people. It was really fun. But she wanted more rhyme in the English. And so we had a disagreement, and and we're very good. We're tight. We're good. But when I read the Portuguese, there's a lot of very subtle rhyme, only because the nature of the language is such that the words have the endings O or A, right? So you get a lot of sort of free rhymes. They're very invisible, so they're there, but they're so subtle. And I was like, no, if you make this rhyme with this, it's very visible. And then it sort of takes over the poem. But what I love about translation is that there can be many translations. And then I told her, you should get somebody to rhyme your poems for you, because I know you want it, and I will do the unrhymed ones. I mean, there's tiny little ones sometimes, and I like sometimes doing alliteration for her, because sometimes they're a little bit less visible, Anyway, so it was just beautiful to have this person talk about the work that way, and a very, very smart, with a beautiful sensitivity. So I did like a batch. So she's going to have a book, and she wanted me to do the book, but I was like, it's not going to be what you want if I do it. You know what I mean? So we sort of have an arrangement where I can do, I will do single poems, but I want her to get somebody to do the book who will be the book she wants, which is something that people from way back don't have any of that, right? But okay, so now linking that to my own work, working with her was so fun, because it was, I put a lot of love, and I love the original, and to have come up with a translation. But I always wanted to be very faithful to her work. And, I know what faithful means, changes from poem to poem, etc. But being faithful to a poem is great, but you see how it could be. You go like, okay, this is the translation. Wouldn't it be fun if it was this in the second line? But I didn't want to do that to her poems. So I was like, I'm going to do that to my own poems, So then it was really fun to work with both at the same time, and to work with my translations, where I was totally not trying to be faithful. So, if there was a line where standard translation challenge, right? Like you have a homophone, that like a word that there's a translation in English, but there's all these other meanings in that word for Portuguese that are not there in this word for English. So I would totally go for it. I would pick one of the other words, that you should not put in, or line breaks when there's word order differences, right? So if you're breaking, especially if it's a formal poem, like the pontoon or anything, if she's breaking in the middle of something where the order is different, you have to think of a solution. Are you going to have it different? What are you going to do? So in my own poems, I'll be like, I'll do whatever's most fun. In her poems, I'll be like, no, I'm going to do whatever carries the beauty and the meaning of the original. So I loved doing that at the same time. It was just a beautiful process. And I love working with her. And I also love that we have a relationship where we can say these things and respect it and understand, and everybody's cool with it. And she's also a very graceful, grateful person. So we have very good community. We're like, no, you go first. No, you go first. Kind of situation. So yes. So
that's great. I love your approach to poetry. You've mentioned so much about, the joy in the line breaks and the sort of mistranslations and the fun that you can have with it. And I think we don't talk about the fun things as often as maybe we should, right? Like the fact that putting these things on the page should give us joy. And I love seeing that and hearing that from you. So when you're approaching translation, maybe of Anna, or if there's another poet who may or may not be alive, what do you sort of put first? Do you really focus on like the structure? Do you focus on the sound, the overall kind of emotional weight of the poem? What do you really favor?
It's so cool. So, the other people that I have translated, it has been more like exercises, like the only person I've really translated, like to get it out was Anna. But the other people, like putting it all together, I think I try to understand what is, I think a flexible approach, try to understand for this poem, what is the thing that needs to be preserved. And I have a very flexible view of what is the important part. I think that can be very different for two different readers, but sometimes there's a more obvious thing in the word. So Anna has very sparse poems with a lot of space for breath. They have very few words. they are short lines, but she has a lot of built-in ambiguity. It's kind of like Clarice Lispector. Clarice Lispector has much more words, but there's this thing going on where you don't realize how many multiple meanings are in a thing. You read it and you're like, oh yeah, sure. And then you go back and look at the sentence and you're like, wait, So she has a lot of missing pronouns, missing gender, and something that you read, you think you know who is the subject, and you're like, wait a second, but the subject could also be this thing. So I think that I wanted to preserve a little bit. And she also has some weird syntax, some weird images, right? But also some weird, very interesting syntax that works, but it's kind of unusual, like just a little jolt here and there. So I wanted to have all these things, but I think she's also very particular. Her poems sort of invited a specific prioritization because the words are so simple. It's like rat, house. I wasn't sort of thinking, is it a mention? Is it because the word is house. It's like the plainest word for that thing. So with other poets, I could be sort of doing more this, like, what is the correct word? For her, it was more like, how sparse can I do that? And when I can't make it as sparse as in Portuguese, for example, missing subjects where it's not so good in the English and it's totally natural, which subject do I choose that will sort of maintain as much of that openness as possible, but that's just because of the features of her poem. So I think it will really depend on where the poet is sort of spending a lot of their energy.
Yeah, and it's great. I love the idea of collaborating on translations because it's great to have that back and forth and that ebb and flow and know that you're getting at what the original poem was supposed to convey. And, that's not always something that poets can take advantage of. So that's great. I wanted to talk a little bit about just publication in general, because this is your first full-length collection, but you have quite a few chapbooks or like the mini chapbook here. So could you talk about, just your different approaches to maybe some of the shorter length projects versus the full-length book, and how you went about the sort of navigating the publication landscape with your work?
Yes. So I think, so first I had a chapbook come out in 2019 called Translation. And that one was the beginning of this, that was the true beginning of this collection, because, it came out in 2019, but I wrote, it takes a long time to actually come out. But because I was writing that chapbook as a collection and it was just so amorphous and cloudy, just this blob. And when I finally found the chapbook in the blob, and it's a smaller thing, I think that really helped me then have an anchor to build a collection around instead of this blob. So that chapbook really helped me. So I made the chapbook. When I carved out the chapbook, I had something to send out. So talking about navigating this publication, then I started sending that out, and it was very satisfying to have something that I'm sending out while I'm working the collection. When you brought out joy, I think people are motivated by different things, right? I know, like, for example, when I was doing my MFA or in any situation that I had like very high pressure and people are like afraid to fail, that doesn't work as well for me. I'm very much positively motivation. Some people are like, fear motivates them. I'm like, no, I positively motivation. So the publication cycle helps me because I think I should have a thing to send to this thing. And I like imagining that nobody will know who I am in this place, which was very easy when I had nothing out. I'll be like, this person, if they don't like this thing, they're just going to click next. They'll never remember it. So that was a very good feeling for me at the time. And having something to send. So I think after you send things out a lot, you can start minimizing any bad feelings about rejection, and you can maximize the hope or being happy with yourself because you sent something, being very happy because you're a finalist or whatever. So if you can balance that emotionally, then submitting becomes fun, but I think it takes a while to get there. So what I say to people is try to get to that place, and then submit a lot to the right places, and use it for motivation in your editing, and stuff like that. Makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. I think, what you've really honed in on there is something that I've heard echoed in some of our other craft chats. Like one of our other poets set like a rejection goal, and it wasn't a bad thing. It was because like that was how she knew she was submitting as many places as she could. So it's kind of that like reframing, not like, oh, another rejection or another like finalist, but at least like my poems or my chapbook or my manuscript is getting out there and people are seeing it. And all the time while it's out there, I'm still working on the other things. So yeah, that kind of positive mindset is so important in such a difficult publication sphere. Is there anything that you do when you're approaching a chapbook that's different than how you put together the full length? I mean, of course, there's different lengths of the manuscripts themselves, but I wonder if like organizationally, is there a different way that you approach that?
Yeah, so I think, I had different experiences with my chapbook. So that first one was very much about carving out, it was so great for editing. I was like, no, I have to be ruthless. I need 20 pages out of these, like so many, so it was very much a narrow, and it took a while. It's kind of like we were saying about saving the drafts of the poem. I would save a smaller and smaller and smaller until I found a core where I could have like emotional criteria of what fit to make it smaller. And that was a much more meandering first chapbook. This micro chapbook, which is smaller than a chapbook, right? Because, it has 20 pages in this, but in manuscript is less, This one was different. It was a very focused experience. I was going through this time with my son, doing all this vision therapy every single day, hours of exercises and dealing with so much stuff. And I just had so much, but I wanted to, have it be a unit, a very tight unit. I wanted to be about that thing. I am not as expensive. So this one was more, I didn't have to cut out so much because I kind of had a clear sense of what it was going to be from the beginning. So I think they were both very different experiences, and I think it's both the work and where you started, you know, and I think I can see in the future both things happening again.
That's great. Oh, we're nearing the end of our chat, which is the worst part. But I'm wondering if you have any craft advice or craft books or anything that you turn to in your process, or just any tips and tricks for our audience as we wrap up.
I love that. So I think there's so much to say, but I'll just say, I think know yourself, right? Like people are different. Listen to yourself. Take very good care of yourself emotionally. You know, try to practice your art in a way that works with your well-being. You know, if you want to go to dark places, find a structure for yourself, and it's a lot of experimentation. So yes, craft books, I just picked up some from my bookshelf. But I'll just say like a couple, but then I'll say a quick thing about craft books. So I like this book, A Little Book on Form. I like this book mainly. I mean, I haven't even read this whole book. I just read little bits, but I like the approach. Like if you read the first pages, it's just a very cool approach. It's like 2 lines means this. Like, you know, I'm like, whoa, I never thought it meant that, but it can mean that and it cannot. But I just love the meaning it puts on form instead of saying, this is a pantun, you know, like it really goes very deep on what it could be. Several short sentences about writing. I like this because it's fun, as well as it being good is just fun. Now, there's some books out there. I think it's challenging models of workshop, crafting real life, and different things. But I think I really, this is not a craft book. It's thinks. I mean, it sounds very paranoid, but it's documented, so it's fine. Yeah, I'm always like, oh my gosh, if I read this in the train, people are gonna think, you know, how the CIA tricked the world's best writers. But it's it just says a lot of things that went out back in the, you know, Cold War, where this money got into the Iowa workshop and all these things. But the point here is, read the craft books and go to the classes or whatever. But if they say something must be like this, you cannot have any abstraction. Take what you need. And if something goes against that, that's fine, and do your thing. So learn the tools that are out there. But if you do something that is doing the opposite of what the craft book is saying, go there too, you know? So have your toolbox, but also use alternative materials and make music of sandals as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that is a perfect way to end. You know, always trust yourself and know yourself, and break the rules a little bit, and find joy in the poems. I know the link is going back up in the chat, but please buy a copy of Motherland, buy a physical copy. I think mine is like in the air somewhere on its way to me. Thank you so much, Ananda, for your time, for your words, and for just sharing so much about your process. This has been a great hour, and I hope that everyone in the audience had a great time as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.